Hi, everyone. Welcome to Writer of the Week. Today we're here with Dr. Mary Plouffe, award-winning author of I Know It in My Heart, Walking Through Grief with a Child. Welcome, Mary. How are you today?
I am great. Looking forward to talking with you, Melissa.
So you said that you didn't plan on writing a book. Can you tell us how I Know It in My Heart came about?
Certainly. It actually started with a favor. My sister asked me on a summer afternoon if I would take her daughter for 3 weeks so that she could participate in a research project, which was an sort of extra treatment after she had gone through a mastectomy and chemo and radiation. She was invited to join this research project, which they hoped would extend the lives of young women who had breast cancer. So I, of course, said yes. Leah Marie was 3 when she came to our house. And that 3 weeks, because of delays and other problems, turned into 4 months. Martha did have the treatment successfully in January, but then after about 24 hours at home, suffered a rare complication of that treatment, was rushed back to the hospital, put on life support, and died a month later. So what we thought was going to be a 3-week adventure turned into a treatment that took her mother's life while she was in my care. I wrote after that to survive for myself, and honestly, I wrote mostly about Leah Marie to help her dad, who was frightened and had been really away because of his work during the 6 to 9 months before Martha died. And so he wanted all my help. We paired as a team, and for the next 6 years, we tried to co-parent her long distance, and I wrote to help him understand why I was advising what I was advising, and to remember for myself so that I could share it with her when she was grown up. When she was 10, Herb remarried and asked me if I would share some of that writing with his new wife and her sisters. And I did that. And that was the first time that it occurred to me that this might be something for more than family. So in 2006, a few years later, I started to take writing classes, and I went to a workshop with the idea of writing a story in which Leah Marie's evolution of grief through childhood would be the centerpiece. I would be the clinical psychologist in the background describing that evolution. I was advised that this had to be a story that included my grief, and that scared me to death, so I put it away for 3 years. The book really didn't get written until 2009 to 2013. I found an agent in 2014 and a publisher a year and a half later, and the book became a reality in 2017.
And it has garnered a lot of critical acclaim. What awards has it been nominated for and won?
It has. I've been very fortunate. It first got an international book award finalist. It's had a number of finalist awards, including the May Sarton Memoir Award, Indies finalist. Let me see, a Living Now silver medal. I think the two that mean the most to me are the Maine Literary Award in memoir. I was a finalist for that, and that's a workshop and an award ceremony that I went to every year since I started trying to learn how to write. So it was delightful to be up on that stage. And most recently, in 2018, it won the Independent Publishers of New England Book of the Year Award, which was a wonderful surprise.
Wow, congratulations.
Thank you.
And you have a very impressive breadth of experience and education. You received your doctorate in clinical psychology from the University of Connecticut. You hold a master's degree from Boston University in rehabilitation counseling, and you have been in private practice for 35 years. Can you walk us through your training and professional career?
Sure. Well, The funny part is I went to college to sing. I was a vocal performance major when I started in a Bachelor of Music program. But halfway through my sophomore year, there were problems in my voice box that were discovered, mechanical problems that meant that wasn't going to be a good career choice. And so I knew instantly that psychology was my next choice. I'd already taken as many extra courses as I could. I did a master's degree at Boston University, and in that program, I worked a lot with paraplegics and quadriplegics, young men who'd gone over the handlebars of a bicycle or a motorcycle or in a diving accident, had their lives changed in an instant. I worked for 5 years after that master's degree and still knew that what mattered to me the most was the psychological adjustment of these young people and psychological adjustment in general. So I went to get a master's and doctorate in clinical psychology at UConn. There I studied more adult treatment, but also did a full-year internship in child so that I could broaden my experience. After that, I came to Maine and worked in a variety of clinical settings, eventually in private practice, doing treatment of children and adults. I consulted to schools, did a lot of testing those first 10 or 15 years of children, and also assessments for the courts and assessments for third-party assessments for the schools. Eventually, I transferred to teaching at the Maine Medical Center Department of Psychiatry. I was offered an opportunity to supervise residents there in adult psychotherapy. I taught a course in adult psychotherapy and eventually courses in object relations theory and practice and supervision of family therapy. So I have done a wide range of things across both child and adult treatment.
So what is object relations theory and practice?
Good question. It is an outgrowth of psychoanalytic theory that looks at the evolution of child development through the lens of the mother-child relationship. And it is a very complex and fascinating way of looking at how personalities develop based on the attachment of the mother and the child and where that works and does not work.
So do you have a childhood connection to the field of psychology? Were you as a child trying to smooth over troubled waters and help people understand themselves and each other?
You know, I thought about that. My childhood connection to psychology is really coming from an Irish background. All of my grandparents were born and raised in Ireland. And being the daughter of a man who was the youngest of 10 children. We were the babies in the family, and we came from this big Irish family where lots was going on, but not much was spoken. Communication was a complicated and varied and thing that included the tip of a hat or a lilt of a brogue or that which was unsaid. My mother was an expert at reading those subtle communications and silences, and I was fascinated by it as a young child. How does she know that that's not what he meant? And how does she know what someone's feeling when they haven't said a word about what they're feeling? And so I think that was really, I was blessed that my parents had a happy marriage, and until my father's death when I was 19, I think they were very content, and she was a happy person, but she was very intuitive, and I learned a lot from her just by watching.
That's fascinating. You were writing a collection of essays on listening. Will you be publishing these as a book?
I'm not sure. That file sits in my computer, and it's called On Listening and the Grace of Being Heard. It was written because my agent, when I presented her with the memoir, said, no one's going to buy a memoir by an unknown psychologist. I'm going to have a hard time selling that. So what else do you write? And she advised me to work on a book of essays, and she would sell that first and the memoir come afterwards. However, at the end of 2015, as I was still working on the last of those essays, my daughter-in-law became ill, and I decided I did not want to put the memoir aside any longer. So I had found out about She Writes Press, and I said, do you know these women who are running their own press? She said, absolutely, and I think they would love this book. So I went and published it with She Writes Press, which is a hybrid press, and that's worked out very well. I haven't tried to publish the essays except as individual essays. Some of them have been published, but since this memoir has come out and done so well, I've really been drawn to writing more about childhood grief, and that's what's taking up my time in writing right now.
You mentioned you have new material you're writing based on what you learned.
Yes, I do. The book itself is about one child's evolution of her grief from the ages of 3 to 15. But as I've had so much time to think about that, I wanted to create something that is a bit more about the theory of that, not just about some individual story. Because I think that the reason childhood grief is unique and has to be treated differently from adult grief is that it is really the loss of three things. It's the loss of mother, the person. It's the loss of mothering, the relationship and the function. And it is ultimately a kind of motherlessness which impacts that identity I talked about a minute ago. Who am I because I don't have a mother? And how am I different because that wasn't there for me? And those three entities, those three expressions of grief, recycle themselves through a child's development and come back as different questions. At 3, Leah Marie's loss of mother was crying for her mother's hugs and kisses. At 13, it was much more about saying, what's wrong with me and who was she and what would she think of me? So I think that if I can write, I'm writing now about those 3 manifestations of grief. I hope they will be useful to clinicians who are trying to understand how to explore grief with children who've had a loss, and also just for all of us in terms of how to build resilience in young people who have had a loss.
Now it's time for Tweet of the Week, but since you aren't on Twitter, we're going to go to Instagram instead. You recently posted Yellow Lady Slippers by Evelyn Dunphy, my new art acquisition, next to an image of a beautiful painting. Can you tell us more about that?
Oh, yes. Evelyn Dunphy is a wonderful watercolor artist here in Maine. She was speaking at a symposium a couple of years ago on the role of artists in the conservation movement. And we hit it off, we became friends. And she is known for her watercolors of Mount Katahdin here in Baxter Park. But when I visited her studio, I was really taken by this one piece, which is of yellow lady slippers. She told me the story of standing in a field looking at Mount Katahdin up ahead and wondering, planning her next Mount Katahdin painting, and then suddenly realizing, looking down, that she was standing in this beautiful patch of lady slippers. And I love the story, I love the painting, and I love the idea because it's so true for me that I'm drawn to details. I'm drawn to the small things that make us all unique and drawn to the individual moment rather than to that large picture. So I bought it and I love it.
Yes, it is very beautiful. Before you do an excerpt reading from your book, I'm going to read some reviews. Kirkus Reviews says that it's a bracing and accessible account of the conflict between emotion and intellect, a remarkable, empathetic, and intense exploration of the nature of grief and guilt, featuring searing personal insights as well as clear-eyed professionalism. The Story Circle Network, for which this book was a May Certain Memoir Award finalist, their review says, "What makes I Know It in My Heart so compelling is the juxtaposition of a heartfelt narrative with a clinical exposition. The profound journey engages and enthralls because it is a moving story of life and death, but the explanation of the grieving process at various stages informs, enlightens, and helps those who are grieving, just as the author hoped when she wrote the book. And we're going to finish with you reading an excerpt from I Know It in My Heart. Can you tell us about the scene you'll be reading from?
I'm going to read from the prologue to the book, which I think gives you a sense of the style of the writing, and it is the piece that the judges read out loud at the award ceremony for the 2018 Book of the Year. I hope it conveys the hope and the resilience that's in the book. It's called Winslow Park. There's a small town park about a mile from my home. It sits on a long, narrow peninsula where the Harrisicot River and the ocean meet. One side looks out to a scattering of islands in Casco Bay, then beyond to open ocean. The other side borders an inlet with a view of Harrisicot Harbor and the small cove around the corner where my house sits, hidden behind the hemlocks. When the tide is in, red and yellow kayaks dot the cove. But a few hours later, blue herons will bend their backs alongside clam diggers in the mud. The trail along the inlet weaves deep into the pine forest, tracing the water's edge as you head to the point. In summer, 100 campsites fill with tents and RVs and people who plant flowers outside their campers for a 2-week stay. But mostly when I go there, the park is empty. I can walk along open ocean, buffeted by crisp winds in the fall, or track footprints in winter snow. Or I can take the inlet trail where spring mud is deep and I am sheltered from the ocean winds. I never tire of this place. I walk to the point where a few benches capture the view. I always head to the same one. It is pebbled granite, thick and solid with a tall angled back. It sits at the tip of the peninsula with the best view of the boats moored in Harrisicot Harbor and the traffic of sailors squeezing through the small channel that links the ocean with the river's mouth. Engraved in the back of the bench is the name of a young woman who grew up just a few miles from me. I know her parents. Her brother played baseball with my son. Her name and the dates of her birth and death are engraved beneath several carefully chosen, loving adjectives. I read them every time I'm there, but they never stick. What always sticks is her story. A vibrant young woman celebrating her 23rd birthday on a camping trip with 2 close friends in western Maine woods, not 70 miles from this spot. A storm, a tree falls. She is killed instantly, her friends untouched. I remember her mother speaking to the crowd that overflowed the South Freeport Church onto its chair-filled front lawn. I don't know how we are standing today, she said, but I think it is because you are all standing with us. I know why I go to this bench. It is not to honor her loss, though I do. It is not to remember my community of friends and neighbors grieving together and supporting her family and building this bench in her memory. It is none of these things. This is, for me, a monument to randomness, to the simple truth that we do not decide our fate, and to the concrete, overwhelming truth that beauty sits with horror, and I must find a way to bear them both. The book is available at any bookstore, and I hope you'll check it out. It is a weaving of child and adult grief, and the big surprise for me has been how many adults have told me that it has been helpful to them at all stages of their grieving journey.
I Know It in My Heart, Walking Through Grief with a Child is available on Amazon, and you can find the link in the description below, as well as the link to Mary's website, maryeplouffeauthor.com, and her Facebook page, Mary Plouffe Author, where you can see essays about childhood and adult grief. It's been a pleasure talking with you today. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Melissa, for inviting me.